Well, this is the talk that really isn't. What I intend by that is that what's covered here won't be tested on any exam, and if you want to turn it off right now, you can feel free. It's just that I found that more than one student has asked me what I personally think all this means. Where is it all going, and what should we be concerned about? Well, that's a fair question, given that I've asked all of you the same, and I want you to apply what you've learned to know better how to live in our current world. So I'm taking off my historian's hat for a bit, and I'll talk more or less straight about my opinions on the trends and implications, and how they seem to be shaping our present and future. And hey, it'll give us all a chance to see how my expectations line up with reality. And do note that this is my opinion as of December 2022. I expect my thoughts will change and evolve as we move forward and encounter new situations and fresh evidence. So, take it or leave it, and understand that I'll be doing the same myself. I do reserve the right to update or simply remove this or change opinions in future terms. As physicist Niels Bohr noted, predictions are hard, especially about the future. The trouble with predicting things is that human beings have a free will, a limited experience, and are extremely complex. Therefore, there is no way any of us, or even a group of us, can account for all the various threads there are out there in the world that we need to know in order to really be accurate. And even if we could, people still have the ability to surprise us. That said, if we step outside our American comfort zone for a moment, I would draw your attention to Chinese history, particularly something called the dynastic cycle. With more than 6,000 years of history, the Chinese have noticed that their ruling dynasties seem to follow a similar pattern. In the beginning, they are created by a powerful, potent, and dedicated individual or group. These individuals are often very gifted, and they usually face a corrupt and defunct government that has a long train of abusing its people. When the new dynasty establishes itself, its people work hard, intelligently, and often are willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the nation. That, of course, means that the nation prospers and the economy grows. Many people become wealthy and secure. At some point, and it can take hundreds of years, wealth and security become the point, and people stop looking out for the good of the nation and focus more on what good they can get for themselves from it. People stop pursuing government jobs because they want to help and instead go for them because they want to get rich. Average citizens are more interested in what the government will do for them than they are in making their own way. As that happens, the essence of what made the dynasty great to begin with fades and is replaced with greed and corruption. Greed and corruption then undermine the foundations of the dynasty. As things begin to fall apart, the government itself becomes more authoritarian and abusive, trying to keep its citizens in line. As the dynasty weakens, its surrounding enemies sense this weakness, and they become bolder and bolder. Finally, the abuses reach the point where a new set of gifted men and women overthrow the dynasty and establish a new one. The process then repeats itself. This is an oversimplification, of course, but hopefully you get the idea. While this is called the dynastic cycle, I don't believe it is uniquely Chinese. In fact, it is human. As I look at American culture since the mid-20th century, I can't help but wonder if we are not, in fact, witnessing the downswing of what we might call a constitutional cycle. Over the past few generations, Americans have grown less and less interested in the principles of their founding, and more interested in how to subvert those principles to get ahead. If that is so, then we need to take care. If the Chinese are any example, we might have some interesting times ahead. Based on the trends that we've seen so far, here are some specific issues you may want to keep an eye on. Watch out for increased factionalism and racialism. The culture war has continued to progress, and the left and right have pulled farther and farther apart. Each time one side digs in deeper, it provokes a more extreme reaction from the other, and more people in the middle are pulled to those extremes. As that happens, it is entirely possible that we will see people become more dedicated to their own particular point of view than they are to the nation itself. They will certainly become more likely to act out against people who disagree with them, sometimes in violent ways. It is entirely possible that rioting in major cities will become more common than it has been recently. Look for other major powers to try to actively knock America out of its spot as leader of the world. In particular, keep an eye on China. China has traditionally considered itself to be the Middle Kingdom, or the center of the earth. It considers Western dominance an aberration in history, and it expects to correct that aberration. You can also expect Russia to try to reassert its own position, as indeed Putin already is. I wish I could say otherwise, but I think you can expect to see the pressure on Christianity in America increase, especially as things become more difficult. Christianity is about servanthood, submission, and it has a strict moral code. That is inherently unpopular in a society focused on personal satisfaction, dominance of others, and doing whatever makes us happy for the moment. Worse, far from securing Christian freedoms, the election of Trump is likely to hasten their demise as a reinvigorated left wings back into power. This time to punish Trump and his supporters, whom they now view as dangerous and immoral. Look for the continued growth of government power and a continued disinterest in the Constitution. As the situation worsens, I expect we'll see more and more people turning toward government as their savior, and they will be willing to cede more and more of their rights if only the government can keep the good times rolling. Increasingly, the Constitution will be seen as an outdated obstacle. Indeed, some on both sides are already calling for it to be revised or replaced entirely. While these are currently extremists, they may become more mainstream before many more years pass. Finally, look out for a possible increase in tension between the states and the federal government. The prime reason for this is simple. The central government can't please everyone. When it decides in favor of one group, it will necessarily outrage the other. Those so outraged will increasingly turn to their state governments as a means of resistance. In fact, we've seen this already, as various liberal states have refused orders from the Trump administration, and some conservative states threaten to do the same with the Biden administration, such as those regarding immigration. I could go on, but needless to say, I believe the next generation or two will face several key tests. If we want the nation to thrive in the future, it had best be prepared to deal with them. If even half of what I fear is true, how we as Christians and Americans react to the next few decades could be decisive. So what do I think we can do about it? Again, I don't want to come off as even hinting that I think I have all the answers, but here are some general thoughts to consider. First, we need to recognize the reality of where we are now as a culture and a nation. While I'm as patriotic as the next person, it does us no good to pretend that things aren't trending badly when they are. It's best to take a deep breath, a hard look at what has happened, and then decide how to move forward. Once we get a grip on where we are, we need to look back at the strong truths of America's founding period and determine how to apply them. The United States was successful for a reason, and we need to bring ourselves and as many as will come with us back around to that point. Even if the nation as a whole refuses to honor these principles, they can still build strong organizations and communities on many other levels, and we'll need those communities moving forward. In order to do that, though, we must first rebuild the philosophical and religious foundations of the nation. The reason the American government worked was because it was created and applied by a largely Christian people, and until those foundations are restored, a return to a government based on those foundations won't make sense. But how do we accomplish it? We begin by making the frank realization that, as Christians, our privileged status in America has ended. In a very real sense, Obama was simply pointing out a fact when he said that America was no longer a Christian nation. We then need to ask the hard question. As a Christian living in a non-Christian and even anti-Christian culture, how should I now live? We have a lot to learn from our brethren in places like China and North Korea. That said, I would offer two specific points to start out. First, as Americans, we need to realize that there is a distinction between Christ and country. Again, don't get me wrong, the U.S. is an amazing place for which I am very grateful, but evangelicals have had a bad habit of elevating their respect for the U.S. almost to the level of worship. I'm reminded of most of the churches in my area, where the American flag is displayed behind the altar on the same level as the Christian flag, the cross, and the Bible. When the U.S. had a solidified Christian consensus, there were fewer conflicts between government and Christianity. As the U.S. continues to polarize and secularize, right and left, this myth of the chosen nation will be harder and harder to maintain. Increasingly, what the country tells us to do will be very different than what Christ calls us to do. To be prepared for those moments, Christians must have a very clear set of priorities and understand that our obligations are first to Christ and then afterward to any government or organization, and that includes the United States. Second, we need to finally put to rest the idea that the United States is some kind of Christian utopia where Christian belief and moral values have a special place. That was truer once than it is now, but it was never true to the extent that myth makes it. We must also rid ourselves of the moral majority way of thinking that imagines America as a Christian majority waiting to reassert itself. What I mean by that is the retake America or make America great again philosophies that have been floating around since the 1980s. They were all based on the idea that most Americans were actually Christian, and that those who weren't were really just a vocal minority attempting to force their views on the majority. Unfortunately, it was unlikely true when Jerry Falwell tried it then, and it undoubtedly is untrue now. The reality is that serious Bible-believing Christians are a clear minority in our country, and we gain nothing by pretending otherwise. Trying to raise political battle flags and reconquer the country by sheer political force is nothing but moonshine, gobbledygook used by shrewd politicians to manipulate Christian conservatives and their votes. The hard truth is that the United States needs to be re-evangelized from the ground up, just like any other pagan nation. The mission field is no longer over there. It's across the street and next door. In fact, if we don't get serious about it, the hopes for the nation's future and our place in it grow bleaker by the day. But for all the harsh realities we have to stomach, there are points of encouragement. It is true that we likely face difficult times, but it is also true that unique challenges beget unique opportunities. The Church in the West, and in the U.S. in particular, is now positioned to experience a revival and a refining that only discrimination and persecution can produce. And if the U.S. has largely forgotten its Christian foundations, increasingly that opens the door for genuine conversions and reintroductions of Christ to newer generations who have grown up without the trappings of belief, and therefore don't necessarily think they know it all already. And in the end, the most important point is to simply remember where our hope lies. As wonderful and blessed a place as the United States has been, as Christians, our hope has never been in it. Our hope belongs in something, in someone much, much greater. In Christ alone, our hope is found. And there we can face the present and the future unflinchingly, knowing that we know the real meaning of the larger story and its ultimate end.